Hello everyone, and thank you for viewing the Missouri Department of Mental Health's Deaf Services training videos. My name is Elijah Buchholz, and I am the Director of Deaf Services for the Missouri Department of Mental Health, and I will be providing these trainings today. Give you a little history about myself. I was raised in a deaf family, and we'll explain and kind of talk about what that means a little bit more when we talk about deaf culture. I was raised signing before I ever spoke. I'm a native American Sign Language user, and that is the language that we use in my household. So these trainings came about, the Missouri Department of Mental Health contracted with Dr. Robert Pollard from the University of Rochester in Rochester, New York, to create a series of online trainings for us. He did so, and feedback we got from those is it seemed a lot of individuals preferred to have a live person to be able to view when they were doing these trainings. Thus, we're creating these training videos. So a lot of the trainings, a lot of the information that we will provide in these trainings comes from Dr. Pollard's online trainings, which are still available and can be viewed on the DMH Deaf Services webpage, which you can see here. I do recommend that you go ahead and take a look at these if you get a chance, as Dr. Pollard includes a lot of great supplemental readings with his trainings that match each one of the units that we'll be presenting. We're doing these live trainings. We did change some of the information up a little bit to match my own personal experiences and some stories that I have to bring to the training materials. We also adapted some of the trainings to reflect specific, Missouri-specific needs and information as far as mental health and deaf mental health goes. So you will see that as well in these videos. To give you a brief outline of what we're going to be doing here. So in this first video, we're going to discuss a little bit of a history and a little bit of introduction, some important key factors to know anytime we talk about deaf mental health care. We will also cover American Sign Language, or ASL is how we'll refer to it throughout these trainings. In our next video unit, we'll discuss deaf culture. The next unit, we'll talk about hearing loss in general and some key developmental areas that pertain to folks with hearing loss, to deaf individuals, to deaf culture, etc. We'll then have a video discussing language disfluency, literacy, and fund of information, and how that applies to deaf individuals, hard of hearing individuals, and in particular how that applies when we're talking about deaf mental health. The next video section will be on how to work effectively with interpreters. We'll have a unit on how to properly assess and evaluate deaf clients, specific things to look for and to make note of in your evaluations of deaf clients. We'll finish up our last video unit discussing effective treatment of deaf and hard of hearing individuals, as well as effective treatment teams, bringing in multiple disciplines, psychiatrists, case managers, including interpreters and treatment teams, therapists, and so on and so forth. To start with a brief introduction of deaf mental health care, it's important to realize two key factors. The first one being the access to services for deaf and hard of hearing individuals, or rather the lack of. Much research and literature that's out there about deaf mental health revolves around the lack of access. There are just not programs, there are not readily accessible staff members who can sign, who understand deaf culture, that are available out there. Specifically in Missouri, we've recently taken a lot of steps to improve what we're doing and to improve that access to services. We are actually one of 8 states that has a full-time director of deaf services or similar position, and we'll discuss that a little more in depth later on. We actually have 2 specialized outpatient centers that employ deaf clinicians, deaf professionals that provide services in American Sign Language and are sensitive to deaf culture, along with specialized inpatient units, a specialized 24/7 crisis hotline for deaf individuals and hard of hearing individuals to access. The second key factor to keep in mind when we're discussing deaf mental health care is we know that in the medical world, psychiatry is very unique in that it relies almost exclusively on communicating with the client. We assess, we diagnose, we treat mental illness all through communication. So communication is key. Now, when we talk about working with deaf individuals, there's a huge gap in services that are accessible through communication. And without accessible communication, you therefore can't provide quality treatment to deaf and hard of hearing individuals that may have mental illness. So communication is key, and you'll see that as a theme that runs through each of these videos. Another key factor when we talk about deaf mental health care is the importance of recognizing deafness not as a disability group, but as a cultural group. Obviously, when I went through the outline of this training, we were going to spend a good chunk of time discussing deaf culture and how deaf culture has come to be, how deaf culture may impact mental illness, and we'll devote an entire unit of this training to that fact. So please keep in the back of your mind as we go through all this information that you view deafness and deaf individuals as a unique minority cultural group. Some important issues as we go out throughout this training as well. Number one, ASL is not English. It's very, very different. Our first video unit here will get more in depth into how ASL is different, into the unique aspects of ASL, and we'll explore this a little bit more. There's a huge myth, particularly in the medical and mental health fields, about lip reading. A lot of professionals tend to think that deaf and hard of hearing folks can automatically read lips and that will give them accessible communication, and that's just not true. The statistic is there's actually only 30% of spoken language can be seen on the mouth, meaning your mouth only makes so many movements and so many shapes. One example that I like to give with this, and feel free yourself to try it at home, look in the mirror and try this, but if you say the word olive oil, it makes the same exact mouth movements and mouth shapes as I love you. Try that out when you're at home sometime in front of the mirror. Another important issue is the English literacy myth. Again, there is a myth that deaf and hard of hearing individuals automatically are literate in English, which is just not true. It is definitely true for some deaf and hard of hearing individuals, but it's not a universal truth, and we'll explore this a little bit more when we talk in a later video unit. You also see throughout these trainings, we'll talk a lot about fund of information, and specifically fund of information gaps. What this refers to is environmental learning. So for those of us that can hear, we pick up such a huge majority of our learning through watching TV, through hearing things on the radio, through passing by and hearing conversations, or as children, you think about visiting the pediatrician and overhearing information that's shared between your parents and the pediatrician. There's so much information that contributes to our fund of information that comes from the environment that a lot of deaf and hard of hearing folks do not receive. Again, we'll explore this in its own unit later on in this training. It's also important, as I said, that deafness and deaf individuals being a cultural group, to recognize that they're a socio-cultural and language minority. Again, when we talk about deaf culture, we'll explain this a little more, but these are important issues to keep in the back of your mind as we go through each one of our units in this video series. So let's discuss ASL, or American Sign Language. To give you a little bit of a background, something you may find very interesting is a lot of folks think that sign language is a universal language, and it is not. In fact, there are over 120 different signed languages across the world. There's not one universal sign language. We even find in Britain, a country that we share an English language with, there is a very different sign language, a British sign language. There's a Mexican sign language. There's a Spanish sign language, a French sign language, a German sign language, 120 different sign languages across the world. American Sign Language we describe as being newly discovered. Now that doesn't mean that American Sign Language is a new language, but it's fairly new to the field of linguistics and to being studied as a language. As a matter of fact, it wasn't until about the 1970s that linguists began studying it and recognizing ASL, American Sign Language, as its own unique language. To give you a real brief example, and as we go through this unit, we'll discuss more in depth how it's different, but to give you a brief example, in English, we would say the words, "The boy climbed the tree." In American Sign Language, we would sign it, "Tree, boy, climb." So you can see it's a very visual language. You can see that it relies on sort of painting a picture of a tree and then showing a boy climbing it. You can see that the orders of the words are very different than they would be in English, and some of the differences just in that one small sentence. Let's talk a little bit about the history of American Sign Language. We presume that back in the 1800s and before then that there was a native signed language in the United States of America. At that time, about 1815, a young man named Thomas Gallaudet was visiting family, and he noticed a 9-year-old little girl in the neighborhood who was off playing on her own, who wasn't invited to play with the other children, and he became fascinated by this. He made attempts to communicate and to engage this young girl, and through these attempts found out that she was deaf, befriended her family, who happened to be very wealthy, and her family commissioned Thomas Gallaudet to go to Europe and to find out how they were educating deaf individuals in Europe at that time, to find out about signed languages, to find out about education in general. Gallaudet's first stop was to go to Britain. At this point in time in Europe, educating deaf individuals was a hot topic, was a hot commodity, was something that was treasured, was something that was shown off to the general public. The general public was fascinated that deaf individuals could learn a language, could be educated in general. And Gallaudet's first stop in Britain was very reluctant to share with him their method of educating, their sign language, and what they were doing with deaf children at the time. And he did not receive a very warm welcome. Same thing also happened with Gallaudet in Germany. It wasn't until he traveled to France where he received a warm welcome, and he was invited to observe and to learn the French Sign Language and to learn the French way of educating deaf children. And there he met a young man named Claire. And in 1817, Gallaudet and Claire moved to America and established the first deaf school here. Along with that, they brought with them French Sign Language. We know through history that at that time, with the establishment of that first deaf school, French Sign Language, intermingled with the indigenous sign language, has evolved to produce what we call American Sign Language today, and the sign language that deaf and hard of hearing individuals use in our country now. So to begin talking about American Sign Language, one thing that's unique is that we have what we call finger spelling. Finger spelling involves 26 different hand shapes that are all done on one hand to show or to demonstrate the English alphabet, our ABCs as we like to call them. This is very different than British Sign Language in that, again, our finger spelling is done on one hand. In British Sign Language, it's actually done on two hands. For example, the vowels in British Sign Language are A, E, I, O, U. They're indicated by the right hand touching the left hand. In American Sign Language, it's all done with just the right hand. Now, finger spelling of English words is done normally just to show proper names. So if I was introducing myself and said, "My name is Elijah," I would spell Elijah. It's also used to emphasize words. So if I'm going to tell you that I'm sick, this is the sign for sick, and I want to really emphasize how sick I was, then I would spell it S-I-C-K. I was very sick to show that emphasis. We also use finger spelling to show numbers. Each number in American Sign Language has its own very distinct sign. So for example, this 1, 2, 3, which is a little bit different than some hearing folks are used to doing 3 like this. In American Sign Language, this is the sign for W. So we do it as 3. This is one of those funny small differences that I experienced as a child growing up in school, where when we would learn how to do our numbers in preschool or kindergarten, and I would sign 3 like this, I'd be corrected by my teachers who'd say, no, you need to do this. And it didn't click for me then that, no, this is W in my culture and in my language, and this is 3. Another thing about finger spelling is it's very easy to learn. You can find the signed alphabet just about anywhere. Google, YouTube, books, handouts, brochures, you can find it all over the place. It's very similar to reading. In fact, when I'm teaching folks how to learn to finger spell and how to learn to read finger spelling, I often recommend that they do it the same way they learn how to read, in that they sound things out. So if I'm finger spelling cat, C-A-T, instead of trying to process C-A-T and then think, what does that spell? Oh, that spells cat. It's easier to go cat, okay. Similar to that you do to reading. Finger spelling, and particular hearing folks making an effort to finger spell to deaf individuals, is very welcomed. It's seen as a very gracious attempt to facilitate communication. It's seen as welcome. Deaf individuals tend to be very patient with hearing folks that try to finger spell to them. They're willing to help them. They're willing to take the time to wait for the hearing individual to finger spell things and get their hands right. And it's a very good gesture. So I suggest, again, trying to go out there, get on the internet, Google, find the alphabet, practice learning the alphabet. And if you're going to work with deaf folks in a mental health setting, it would go a long way to show your willingness to communicate by learning the alphabet and attempting to sign with them. Now, when we talk about language, there are 4 elements to any language. And I'm not going to get too scholastic with this, but I want to kind of set us up to learn about ASL through these 4 elements. The first of these elements being vocabulary, which obviously is concepts. The second element being grammar, or how that vocabulary is then altered to show different meanings. The third we call syntax, which is the order of vocabulary. The boy climbed the tree is the order of that English sentence. And then the fourth element of language is discourse, or how the conversation unfolds, or the conversation style. So we'll go through talking about American Sign Language on these 4 elements and how it differs from English, how it's unique in its own language. So start off with this. Let's talk about ASL vocabulary. ASL vocabulary has 5 key elements to it. The first of these being unique hand shapes, the shape that your hand makes. There are about 40 different hand shapes in American Sign Language vocabulary, obviously 26 being the hand shapes of the alphabet, and then the other 14 or so shapes not being part of the alphabet. When we talk about vocabulary, the location of the hand shape will change the meaning. And what I mean by that is this is the letter K. Now, if I put K here, that's the sign for king. If I put K here, that's the sign for party. So that one hand shape and where it is located on the body changes the meaning. Same hand shape, different location means a different meaning. Another key factor to the meaning of a sign is palm orientation. So this hand shape here, going the palm facing me, is good. The same hand shape, the same movement, the same location on my body, going this way with the palm facing out means bad. So those are opposite signs with the same hand shape, same motion, the same location, but the way that the palm is facing changes the meaning of that word. Similarly, if I was going to say mine, the palm pointed towards me means mine, the palm pointed out will mean yours. Again, opposite meanings, same hand shape, same location, generally speaking, but the palm facing in and the palm facing out changes the meaning of that word. The movement of the sign or of the hand shape will also change the meaning of the word. Just like I showed you, coming in being mine, coming out being yours. Another example of that would be mine, yours. If I pointed it kind of at a different angle, it could be his or hers. That could be theirs if I move it in a circular motion and I'm indicating multiple people and it belongs to them. The fifth element of ASL vocabulary, and this is very unique and very special to American Sign Language, is what we call non-manual markers. These could be facial expressions, they could be postures, they could be movements of the head or the torso. And when we talk about non-manual markers, these serve as linguistic functions and not emotional functions. And I point this out because a lot of these non-manual markers appear in the face and facial expressions. A lot of meaning is communicated through facial expressions. One example for you is asking questions. So if I'm asking a rhetorical what, I may say, what? If I want an answer to my question, I'll say, what? And we're communicating that difference between rhetorical question through tonality, through the way that we're, the tone and the way we express that same word of what. In sign language, we do this through the use of non-manual markers. Rhetorical question, I may do my eyebrows up, my eyebrows down. Another example is the tongue being protruded tends to communicate carelessness. So if I'm telling you about this person on the highway who is driving like a madman, in English I may raise my voice, I may emphasize certain words by saying them a little louder or saying them with more emphasis. In sign language, I may use my tongue to say, they were driving crazily. And so that emotion and that emphasis is shown through specific body movements or through specific non-manual markers. Some key differences in vocabulary with American Sign Language. In ASL, we tend to be much more specific than in English, which tends to classify things. Now what this means is, for example, if I'm going to tell you about somebody breaking into my house and stealing my tools, I'm going to say, somebody broke into my house and stole my tools. I'm not going to list out for you every single tool that was stolen. In American Sign Language, we don't have a sign for tools. We're very specific about that. So we will assign somebody broke into my garage and stole my hammer, my screwdriver, my wrench, and we'll give you a list rather than a generic kind of classifier term of tools. Similarly with jewelry. So if I'm talking to you about a box of jewelry I bought at a garage sale, in English I would use the term jewelry. In ASL I would have to be more specific. Rings, necklace, watch or bracelet, and so on and so forth. So that's very unique to American Sign Language. Another example to this, which would apply in a mental health setting, is as mental health clinicians, it's very common for us to ask clients, have you ever had suicidal thoughts? Have you ever tried to commit suicide or attempted suicide? In ASL, we don't really have a sign for suicide. So there again, we would give you a list of potential ways to commit suicide. So rather than saying, have you ever tried to kill yourself, we would say, have you ever tried to hang yourself or taken pills or cut your wrist? Or we would give a list and then maybe say, etc. at the end to kind of show the meaning and show what we're trying to communicate. ASL is also very unique in that it uses what we call classifiers. Classifiers are a single sign that could possibly have a variety of meaning. So for example, I showed you this being the number 3. Now if I turn this hand shape this way, it could mean any variety of vehicles. So if I'm telling you a story about my boat, I will first establish this is my boat, and then I will show you what my boat did. If I'm telling you a story about driving, I will say my car, and I'll show you this is my car, and then I'll show you what my car did. Maybe you're skidding out. But this one sign can show a variety of different meanings, can be any kind of vehicle, could be showing what that vehicle does. This is very unique, and it also can conserve time, because you can communicate a lot with this one sign that could take a lot of English words to do. Another vocabulary difference in American Sign Language is there are a lot of words that are not used in American Sign Language. Some examples of these are things like be, is, are, was, were. Typical English words are used quite often like that. We don't have signs for in ASL. We don't use them in ASL. Another unique difference we talked about with finger spelling. We talked about finger spelling proper names. So if I'm introducing myself, I'll say my name is Elijah and spell it. But I will also have a personal name sign. I will have a sign that indicates who I am. For me, it's doing this. It's an E right here, means Elijah. So those folks that are familiar with me, instead of talking about me, hopefully in good ways, instead of finger spelling Elijah every time they mention me, they can just do this. We know this is Elijah. These are also used, these name signs are also used in or for cities, countries, specific locations in a city, and they could be very unique to that local region or that local area. Name signs are also treated differently in different parts of the country. So here in the Midwest, we tend to do introductions by saying, hello, my name is Elijah, spelling it out, and then immediately showing you this is my name sign. In some parts of the country, particularly up in the Northeast, name signs are considered to be very personal. I think this comes from there being a lot of deaf individuals there. Maybe a lot of folks have the exact same name sign, so it's more of a personal, more of an intimate sign in their culture in the Northeast. And so they don't tend to tell just anybody what their name sign is, versus here in the Midwest. In Missouri, in Kansas, we go ahead and show our name signs, and that's how we introduce ourselves and how we're known. The use of space is also very unique in American Sign Language. So what we do with this, and there's no comparison to this in spoken language, is space around the body can be assigned specific meanings. To give you an example, if I'm telling you about a conversation I had, I may assign this space to being Tom. I may assign this space to being Kelly. So now when I'm telling you about Tom and Kelly's conversation, I'll turn this way and speak as Kelly. Then I'll turn this way and speak as Tom. Again, this is unique in American Sign Language and can save a lot of time in the communication process, because here I can say a lot of things in sign language that would take, I can use little signs, that would take a lot of English words to communicate the meaning of. Like an entire conversation between Tom and Kelly. Directional verbs can also be used when we're assigning space. So if I'm telling you about Stan, again, I can establish this is Stan. So now every time I say that, Stan called me, instead of saying Stan called me, I can use one sign. You know when I'm coming from this area to me, that Stan is doing something involving me. Rather than 3 words of Stan called me, we're using one sign, Stan called me. The use of pronouns is also something that's very different in American Sign Language. To give you a little English lesson refresher here, in case you're not sure what pronouns are. Pronouns are things such as him, her, he, she, things like that. We don't tend to use those words, him, her, he, she. We more often assign space around the body to indicate that person, and then you know that any signs involving that space involves that person. The way we communicate tense is also done very differently in American Sign Language. So in English, we convey tense through grammar or through changing the vocabulary. For example, we'll say, right now I'm eating. I would like to eat. I already ate. and we're changing that word eat or using a whole different vocabulary word to communicate the tense of it. In American Sign Language, tense is usually set up first. So if I'm telling you about something I did last week, I'm going to say last week, so now you know everything from that point on is referring back to last week. So last week I ate at that restaurant, blah, 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 until you then change the tense until the current or to the future, you're discussing last week. So it's set up very different in that it is set up rather than using different vocabulary words or different grammar to express those. So let's talk about ASL grammar a little bit. ASL grammar, again, varies very differently than English grammar, particularly when we talk about nouns and verbs. So in ASL, we may use the same exact sign to be a noun and to be a verb. For example, this sign, this hand shape, if we do two short ones, would mean a plane. So you're indicating a noun. If we do one long one, it would indicate a verb as in flying. So plane or flying. Another example would be the sign for broom. So if I do it two short ones, I'm indicating that that vocabulary means a broom. Again, grammar is how vocabulary is altered. So if I do one long one, it could be sweep or sweeping versus broom. We also, again, in English, tense tends to come out in the grammar, eat, ate. And in ASL, we use vocabulary to show that and not grammar, meaning we set up the tense and until it's changed, everything stays in that tense. Now we're going to talk about ASL syntax. Syntax means the order that vocabulary is presented. One significant difference between American Sign Language and English is that American Sign Language tends to be very topic prominent, where English is very subject prominent. Now what that means is in English, we tend to discuss a subject. We'll discuss that Tom did this or Tom said that. In ASL, we don't necessarily focus on the subject, we focus on the topic. So we may be talking about driving, and the entire conversation will be on the topic of driving until we then change that topic. There's also a huge emphasis on changing the topic. That change needs to be very explicit in American Sign Language. Versus in English, we'll talk about Tom, and we may talk about several different things focused on Tom. ASL syntax is also very different when we talk about nouns and adjectives. It's closer related to French or Spanish or any of those Romance languages in that nouns precede adjectives. What that means, again, in English, when we're describing something, we'll say that red car, that blue sky. In ASL, those are switched around. So we'll say car red or day cold rather than having the adjective come first like it does in English. Another significant difference in ASL syntax is that verbs tend to come on the end. If you remember the example sentence I shared with you, tree, boy, climb. So the verb, the action comes at the very end, the climbing comes at the end. That's very common in American Sign Language, that the action comes at the very end of a sentence. ASL discourse is also something that's very unique from English or from hearing culture and how the conversation unfolds and what the conversation style looks like. One major difference is in American Sign Language, feedback is expected. What I mean from that is you don't just sit there and listen, you're an interactive listener. So if somebody's telling a deaf person is signing to me, telling me a story, I'm going to be nodding my head, I'm going to be saying things, yes, oh, that's right, or yeah, I agree with you. And I'm constantly interacting throughout that conversation, whether it's necessarily my turn to speak or not. Feedback and listener feedback is highly, highly valued in American Sign Language and in deaf culture. We'll talk a little bit about that again when we get to the deaf culture unit of this video series. Some of these discourse differences or discourse patterns or how the conversation unfolds has actually come up in my personal life, and it's fascinating, specifically with my wife, who is hearing and from a hearing culture. It still is taking us time to kind of get used to our communication differences, because she will often think that I'm interrupting her, and I get in trouble for it all the time. Honey, stop interrupting me. I'm trying to talk here. And in my culture, I'm not interrupting. I'm interacting with the conversation. And that's tough, that merging of two completely different conversation styles. This is something else that is very unique and very different, and something I've had some sources of difficulty sometimes with my wife and other people is the way that we communicate is more similarly in deaf culture and American Sign Language to the diamond, if you look at the PowerPoint here. In that, in American Sign Language, we tell you the topic or tell you the point, then we elaborate on it, and then we recap the point again. I don't know if any of you listen to jazz music, but jazz music is set up similarly to this, in that they will play the song, and then they will do a bunch of solos, and then they'll play the song again at the end. Similarly, in conversation American Sign Language, we tell you the topic or the point, then we elaborate on it, and then we tell you the point again. This is very different than in English and hearing cultures, in that it's more like the triangle there on the PowerPoint, where we tend to give all kinds of context and background and elaboration first, and then we get to the point of what we're trying to say. Now again, I think you can see how these two different conversation styles could potentially butt heads and cause issues. Again, there are times when I communicate with my wife or even children where I just think, what's the point? What are you trying to tell me? You're giving me all this detail and all this content and all this setup. Tell me the point first, and then they'll tell me. And I'll think, okay, now I know, go ahead and elaborate on it. It's very fun sometimes to kind of notice that in our conversations. Of course, both of these two conversation styles can cause issues when we're talking about interacting between hearing clinicians or hearing individuals and deaf individuals. Obviously, you can see how different these are, and I've given you some personal examples from interacting with my wife and my family. It can definitely cause frustration. It can impede understanding. It's not always easy to realize that there's these two different conversation styles happening in the middle of the conversation. I can tell you, I definitely, being aware of these differences, I still don't notice it when I'm communicating with my wife or whoever until after the fact, and I'm thinking back to, man, we were kind of butting heads. What happened there? Oh, we had these two different discourse styles going on. But understanding this can be very helpful and can help guide conversations that you have with deaf folks, particularly when we talk about in a mental health setting as a hearing clinician working with a deaf person. It's important to recognize these key communication differences and how these may be affecting the interaction in the mental health setting. Now I want to talk a little bit about some other signed languages or some other means of communication that may come up in your work with deaf and hard of hearing folks. The first one we're going to group into what we call manually coded English, or MCE. This actually refers to several different systems of signing. All of these systems use English vocabulary, English syntax, discourse, and grammar, such as be, is, was, were, his, her. They have often have signs for suffix or endings like running, where we don't have that in American Sign Language. These are more similar to signing English rather than a unique language. There are some that use American Sign Language signs in English way. For example, butterfly, they may use the ASL sign butter and fly, butterfly, to try to communicate that concept. There's also something we call Pidgin Sign Language. Linguists now have a more fancy term for this, but essentially it's a combination of ASL signs, using English syntax or grammar, discourse, or kind of a mixture of English and American Sign Language together. There's also called simultaneous communication, or for short we call it SIMCOM. Sometimes it's referred to as total communication, which we speak English, but we sign at the same time that we're speaking. That is a form of a manually coded English language. And here's just kind of a list of several different kinds. There's SEE 1 and 2, that stands for Signed Exact English. There's SIMCOM, simultaneous communication, sign-supported speech, total communication, various methods of signed languages that rely more heavily on the English language than they do on American Sign Language. There's also a form of communication. We see this, particularly in Missouri, is a little more rare than it may be in some other parts of the country, but it's called cued speech. It's a manual way of communicating, but there's no signing involved, no signs involved. A lot of it relies heavily on reading lips, lip reading, and it involves 8 different hand shapes that occur in different facial or throat locations to help communicate the meaning. And then we're also going to talk a little bit about oralism. We'll get into this a little more in depth when we talk about deaf culture. We'll talk more about oralism. But basically, oralism entails no use of American Sign Language or manually coded English or cued speech. It has a heavy focus on lip reading and relying on natural hearing. When we talk about oralism, signing is often discouraged, and more so in the past than now, folks were punished for attempting to learn or to use sign language. There's always been a very strong historic divide between those in this oralism camp and those who prefer to use different signed methods. There's been very strong, extreme rigid feelings from those in the sign language camp against oralism, and it's very similar to some of the strong, extreme, rigid feelings and beliefs that we see today revolving around hot button issues like abortion or gun control and things like these. Again, we'll talk about this a little bit more in depth when we get to the deaf culture section. There are obviously several different systems of communication that I've presented to you here. There are also some consequences to having these different systems, different schools using different methods. Children only learn what they're exposed to, so some children will learn American Sign Language. Some may learn a certain form of manually coded English. Others will learn the oralism method or cued speech or various. So what happens once school is over and these folks then are out interacting with each other and are using these different modes of communication? This diversity definitely impedes communication in the deaf and hard of hearing communities. There's lots of debates and research that continues today, and it's unlikely that we'll ever or anytime soon reach a full consensus as to which method of educating and what method of communication we provide to deaf and hard of hearing individuals. That's the end of Unit 1, discussing an introduction and American Sign Language. I thank you for watching this unit and encourage you to continue on to Unit 2, where we'll talk about deaf culture. If you do have any questions or you have any comments or want to do any further follow-up on any of the material presented in this unit, feel free to reach out to me at either this phone number or email on the PowerPoint. Thank you.